This is Larry Rosenthal of the Goldman School with some remarks on defining the problem, some tips on things to avoid. First, do not try to complete your whole analysis with your problem definition. Next, do not embed solutions in your problem definition. Third, do not hamstring your problem definition with value conceptions and save those for criteria. Last, do not expand or confine the scope of your problem definition excessively. Let's look at these 3 tips from Gene Bardak on his 8-step path method. Step 1, defining the problem. And let's refer back to some of the exact same issues that we addressed in our prior video. First, do not try to complete your whole analysis with your problem definition. You'll recall that we had a headline: rooftop solar installations face reluctant homeowners. A draft problem definition might read, unless all homeowners are subsidized for at least 50% of solar panel installation cost, the carbon reduction targets set for 2020 will not be reached. You can see how this statement captures a number of elements that should be looked at more carefully at later steps along the way in the eightfold path. Something more economical as far as directness and identification without adding in numerical targets for solutions, specifics as to alternatives, chronological dates that have been set by policy conceptions that may not be used later on in our policy analysis, makes this comparison problem definition much better. As we discussed during the last lecture, homeowners lack private motivation to maximize renewable energy consumption. That'll allow us to get to the alternatives, the evidence, the criteria, the trade-offs, the outcomes, each in their turn, with sufficient focus. Next, another thing to avoid: do not embed solutions in your problem definition. Here's an example from before on dental patients. Too few dental patients with below poverty level incomes receive guaranteed subsidies or provider-sponsored price breaks. Guaranteed subsidies and provider-sponsored price breaks are clearly solutions we may wish to consider, but we'll get to them at the alternative stage. At this point, we merely wish to define the problem. And here's how we ended up in the prior lecture. Too few at-risk dental patients have sufficient insurance to cover the cost of root canal procedures. Third, out of these 4 tips on things to avoid in problem definition, do not hamstring your problem definition with value conceptions. Let's save those for criteria. A draft relating to drug advertising might read, consumers of new pharmaceutical products are being brainwashed by ridiculous television advertisements and their never-ending recitation of side effects. This draft embeds a number of value statements. First, the fact that consumers aren't being informed, rather they're being brainwashed. Next, that these advertisements are in a sense illogical and ridiculous, that they don't even achieve any communication or useful information delivery. And lastly, this never-ending feature may be never-ending for some consumers, but not all. If we go back to our earlier preferable statement of the problem, we'll see how we have left value conceptions for later stages, perhaps for criteria, perhaps for how we define, how we identify our alternatives. Regulations requiring drug companies to list possible side effects in their advertisements are failing, since too few consumers are being adequately informed when considering medication options. This is a neutral statement as to the social condition that needs addressing and the objective for advancing towards improvement. Last, do not expand or confine the scope of your problem definition excessively. This is hard to describe in a way that will be equally applicable to all potential public policy analytic opportunities and projects. But we can say for certain with this example that we had from before, if we start with parents of K through 12 students tend not to attend their kids' theater and music performances as much as they do when their kids play sports, participate in student government, or volunteer in the community. we can see that as to the activities that parents do attend, music and theater, if we add comparative activities like sports, student government participation, volunteering in the community, and if we expand beyond the high incidence of these activities in high school to everything starting from kindergarten, we will be providing to ourselves much too steep a hill to climb. We want to define the problem in a way that makes our public policy analysis well scoped and capable of completion. So going back to our earlier version, half the number of high school parents attend their kids' theater and music performances compared to sports. We have a much more confined and easily tolerated problem definition, one that we can attack, and all these other issues can be left for a later policy analysis on another day. Two other earlier examples will help us to further illustrate these tips on things to avoid in problem definition. First, let us imagine a traffic safety problem statement that reads, "Idiots speeding during rush hour makes life dangerous for everyone else, so we need to imprison more drivers." This draft would have a number of the problems that we've identified, calling speeding vehicles, those drivers, idiots, certainly embeds a value statement. Identifying the victims of these choices as everyone else indicates that we won't be looking at how carefully they're driving, which of course could be an important factor. And lastly, this embeds a solution, namely throwing risky drivers into prison. We want to avoid all of these things, as we've discussed. One other example, which echoes an earlier offering in the prior lecture, and this had to do with post-incarceration employment. Say we were to phrase the draft problem statement as follows: ex-convicts are perfectly safe to employ, but a bunch of uninformed companies are discriminating unlawfully and pretending these guys haven't already served their time. Well, there's strong value statements by calling a formerly incarcerated person an ex-convict, which may be a source of terminology that itself has discriminatory value for some listeners. It compares a world where rehabilitation has been achieved with a world where it hasn't, and that may be useful in looking at employment opportunities. It may not be. And to identify these companies as being uninformed and discriminating unlawfully begs the question of how many such companies there are and what the exact state of legal enforcement may be. Let's summarize. These are the tips that we've discussed in defining the problem, things to avoid. Do not try to complete your whole analysis with your problem definition. Do not embed solutions in your problem definition. Do not hamstring your analysis with value conceptions. Perhaps save those for criteria. And lastly, do not expand or confine the scope of your problem definition excessively. Thanks for listening, and good luck with your work.